On Thanksgiving weekend in 1928 in York County, Pennsylvania, a belief in witchcraft led to one of America's most bizarre murder cases. What started as superstition ended in a ritual murder, revealing a dark underbelly of folk magic, curses, and supernatural terror in rural America. John Blymeyer was a struggling powwow practitioner, someone who practiced Pennsylvania Dutch folk magic. For years, his life had spiraled downward with unexplained illnesses, failed crops, and persistent bad luck. He became convinced he'd been cursed, hexed by a more powerful witch who was slowly destroying his life through supernatural means. His suspicions focused on Nelson Rehmeyer, an elderly farmer known throughout the community as a powerful hex doctor. Rehmeyer lived alone in a remote hollow, a place locals called Hex Hollow, where he practiced his craft away from prying eyes. Blymeyer believed Rehmeyer possessed his hex book, a grimoire containing the magical locks that kept Blymeyer cursed. Blymeyer recruited two desperate believers, John Curry, 14, and Wilbert Hess, 18. He convinced them that the only way to break Rehmeyer's curse was to steal his hex book and obtain a lock of his hair, which would need to be buried 6 feet underground during a full moon. If Rehmeyer resisted, Blymeyer claimed they would need to kill him to break the curse's power. On November 27, 1928, the three men entered Rehmeyer's isolated farmhouse after dark. They demanded he give them his hex book and submit to having his hair cut. Rehmeyer, a large man in his 60s, fought back fiercely. What followed was a scene of primal violence fueled by supernatural terror. The attackers beat Rehmeyer brutally, but he continued to resist with impossible strength. Blymeyer, convinced this was proof of Rehmeyer's dark powers, believed the witch was supernaturally enhanced and impossible to kill through normal means. The struggle continued for hours in the darkness of the isolated farmhouse. Finally, they tied Rehmeyer to his bed and strangled him with a length of rope. But even in death, Rehmeyer terrified them. Blymeyer claimed he could feel the witch's power still emanating from the corpse, that Rehmeyer's spirit was attempting to curse them even as they murdered him. In panic, they doused the body in kerosene and set the farmhouse on fire, hoping to destroy any remaining magical power. The fire raged through the night, visible for miles across the Pennsylvania countryside. When authorities arrived, they found Rehmeyer's charred remains and discovered evidence of the brutal attack. The three killers were quickly arrested, and their confession revealed a worldview where curses, hexes, and supernatural forces were absolute reality. The trial became a sensation. Defense attorneys argued the men genuinely believed in witchcraft and acted in self-defense against supernatural attack. Prosecutors painted them as deluded killers who murdered an innocent old man. But testimony from community members revealed something disturbing. Many locals believed in hexes, curses, and the power of folk magic. Rehmeyer had indeed practiced as a hex doctor, and people came from across the region seeking his supernatural services. The jury convicted all three men of murder, but the case raised uncomfortable questions about the persistence of magical thinking in modern America. Here were people in the 20th century who believed so completely in supernatural curses that they committed murder to protect themselves from them. But the story doesn't end with the convictions. Hex Hollow itself developed a sinister reputation. Rehmeyer's burned-out farmhouse became a place people avoided, claiming his spirit still lingered, still practicing dark magic from beyond the grave. Locals reported strange lights, unexplained sounds, and an overwhelming sense of dread when passing the property at night. Years later, paranormal investigators documented unusual electromagnetic readings at the site and claimed to capture evidence of supernatural activity. Skeptics dismissed these findings, but the legend of Hex Hollow persists. The Hex murder case represents something deeply unsettling about human nature. Our capacity to believe in invisible forces with such conviction that we'll kill to protect ourselves from them. Whether curses are real or imagined, their power to drive people to violence is undeniable. In Hex Hollow, that power claimed a life and created a legend that refuses to die.
On the night of February 1, 1959, 9 experienced hikers died under circumstances so bizarre that investigators struggled to classify their deaths. What happened on the slopes of Kholat Syakhl Mountain in Russia's Ural Mountains remains one of history's most disturbing unsolved mysteries, with evidence suggesting something far beyond normal human experience. The group, led by Igor Dyatlov, were all seasoned hikers from the Ural Polytechnic Institute. They set up camp on the mountain's slope despite having planned to camp in a more sheltered valley below. Search parties would later wonder why experienced mountaineers would make such a fatal decision, camping on an exposed slope in -30-degree temperatures. When rescuers found their tent 3 weeks later, what they discovered defied all logic. The tent had been slashed open from the inside, as if the hikers had been so desperate to escape that they couldn't even take the few seconds needed to unzip the entrance. Their boots, coats, and survival gear lay abandoned inside the tent. 9 people had fled barefoot into a frozen wilderness in the middle of the night, running from something so terrifying that certain death from exposure seemed preferable. The bodies told an even more disturbing story.
Found 2 months later, buried under 4 meters of snow in a ravine, these victims had suffered catastrophic injuries. Ludmila Dubinina's chest was crushed with force equivalent to a car crash, yet her body had no external wounds. Her tongue, eyes, and part of her face were missing, removed with surgical precision. Alexander Zolotaryov had similar chest trauma, ribs shattered inward with such force it should have killed him instantly. Nikolai Thibaut Brignol's skull was fractured, the bone compressed inward as if hit by something with tremendous force. The Soviet investigators were baffled. The force required to cause these injuries was described as equivalent to being hit by a car, yet there were no external wounds, no signs of a fight, no animal tracks. One doctor noted the injuries were similar to those seen in victims of extreme pressure changes, like being near an explosion. But the evidence grew stranger. The victim's clothing was found to contain high levels of radiation, far beyond normal background levels. Some bodies had unusual tan coloring, while others appeared to have aged rapidly. Their hair had turned gray. Most disturbing were the reports from the rescue team that the bodies seemed to glow in the dark, emitting a strange phosphorescent light. Local Mansi tribespeople refused to go near the area, calling the mountain "Don't go there" in their language. They spoke of strange lights in the sky, balls of fire that moved with purpose, and spirits that killed those who trespassed on sacred ground. The night the hikers died, other hikers camping 50 kilometers away reported seeing strange orange spheres floating in the night sky in the direction of Kholat Syakhl. Soviet authorities initially classified the deaths as caused by a compelling unknown force and closed the case, sealing the files for decades. This official acknowledgement that something unexplainable had occurred only deepened the mystery. Modern theories range from avalanche to military testing to infrasound-induced panic, but none fully explain the evidence. An avalanche doesn't explain the radiation, the missing body parts, or why experienced hikers would camp on an exposed slope. Military testing doesn't explain the lack of external injuries or the specific nature of the trauma. Infrasound-induced panic doesn't account for the physical injuries or the glowing spheres witnessed by other hikers. The Dyatlov Pass incident stands as a testament to how little we understand about the world around us. 9 people died on that frozen mountain, and despite decades of investigation, we still cannot definitively explain what killed them or what they saw that was so terrifying they chose to run to their deaths rather than face it.
In 1957, in the small English town of Hexham, tragedy struck the Pollock family when their 2 daughters, Joanna 11, and Jacqueline, 6, were killed by a speeding car. The grief was unbearable for parents John and Florence Pollock, but something impossible was about to happen that would challenge everything science understands about consciousness, memory, and the nature of existence itself. A year after losing their daughters, Florence became pregnant. John Pollock became convinced, despite medical evidence showing a single fetus, that his wife would give birth to twin girls who would be reincarnations of their dead daughters. Doctors told him this was impossible, but on October 4, 1958, Florence gave birth to identical twin girls, Gillian and Jennifer. What happened next cannot be easily dismissed as parental wishful thinking or childhood imagination. The evidence was physical, documented, and witnessed by multiple people who had no belief in reincarnation. Jennifer, the younger twin, was born with birthmarks that exactly matched scars Jacqueline had on her body. On her forehead was a mark identical to a scar Jacqueline had received from falling. On her waist was a birthmark that precisely matched a distinctive birthmark Jacqueline had possessed. Gillian had no such marks, just as Joanna had no scars. When the twins were 4 months old, the Pollocks moved to a different town, wanting to give their new daughters a fresh start away from the tragedy. The girls grew up with no knowledge of their dead sisters, no photos displayed, no stories told. Yet, as they began to speak, they demonstrated knowledge that seemed impossible. At age 3, the family returned to Hexham for the first time since the girls' birth. As they drove into town, Gillian and Jennifer, who had never been there, began pointing out landmarks. "That's where we used to live," they said, pointing to their old house. "That's the school we went to," identifying the building Joanna and Jacqueline had attended. The girls guided their parents through streets they'd never seen, naming places with perfect accuracy. The twins asked for toys by name, toys that had belonged to their dead sisters but had been given away before the twins were born. They described details of their dead sisters' lives with impossible accuracy. They knew the names of Joanna and Jacqueline's friends, children the twins had never met or heard mentioned. Most disturbing was their behavior near the intersection where the accident occurred. The girls, who had never been told about the tragedy, became hysterical when approaching the location. They clung to their parents, screaming about the car and begging not to go near. They described in perfect detail how Joanna had tried to protect Jacqueline, throwing herself in front of the car, exactly as witnesses had reported the accident happening years before the twins were born. The twins played games that recreated their sisters' deaths. They would lie on the floor, one covering the other, acting out the accident in disturbing detail. They spoke about when we were big and before we came back. Most chilling were the times they discussed their own funeral, describing flowers and people present at services they couldn't possibly remember. Dr. Ian Stevenson, a psychiatrist from the University of Virginia, extensively documented the case. He interviewed the family, neighbors, and witnesses, ruling out fraud, coaching, or cryptomnesia. The birthmarks, the impossible knowledge, the behavioral patterns all pointed to something that mainstream science couldn't explain. As the twins grew older, around age 5, the memories began to fade. They stopped talking about their previous lives, the panic near the intersection disappeared, and they developed normal personalities distinct from their dead sisters. By age 7, they retained no memories of being Joanna and Jacqueline. The Pollock twins case remains one of the most compelling documented instances of potential reincarnation. Skeptics argue for unconscious cues from parents, despite the family's attempts to keep the tragedy hidden. They suggest the birthmarks are coincidence, though medical experts found them statistically improbable. They claim the girls somehow absorbed information through means unknown, creating false memories. But these explanations strain credibility as much as reincarnation itself. How does a child develop birthmarks matching scars of a dead sibling?
How do 4-year-olds navigate a town they've never visited? How do they describe events from before their birth with perfect accuracy when their parents deliberately kept this information from them?
If these stories sent chills down your spine, don't vanish into the darkness without hitting that like button. Share your scariest experience in the comments below, because your story might be featured next. And remember, the scariest thing is missing out. So subscribe now, before the next nightmare finds you.